I want you to picture a stretch of open water in the South China Sea, specifically an area near the Scarborough Shoal.
Right, which is already a deeply contested, super tense area on a normal day.
Oh, absolutely. It's tense. And you have this Philippine resupply vessel trying to navigate the area, and suddenly these massive Chinese Coast Guard ships just move in.
Yeah, and they aren't just, blocking the path or doing standard maneuvers.
No, they are firing high-pressure water cannons directly at the Philippine crew. I mean, the impact is so severe that a crew member is actually badly injured.
Which is terrifying. I mean, water cannons at that scale can tear metal.
Exactly. It's the kind of flashpoint that usually results in, frantic diplomatic calls and strongly worded letters from embassies. But in this specific incident that's detailed in our sources today, something else happened.
Something very physical.
Right. A United States Coast Guard vessel, which just happened to be on site, physically maneuvered itself right into the crossfire. Yeah. An American ship literally put its steel hull between the Chinese water cannons and the injured Philippine sailor to facilitate a rescue.
It is a stunning visual, isn't it?
It really is.
You are talking about American personnel placing their physical ship and their own lives in the line of fire to shield an ally from a rising superpower.
Yeah.
It takes the highly abstract, honestly kind of academic concept of a mutual defense treaty and just turns it into a visceral, highly dangerous reality right there on the water.
And that reality is basically the perfect entry point for what we are doing today, because we are taking a deep dive into a geopolitical briefing that is completely devoid of the usual diplomatic polish.
Right, no careful UN speeches here.
Exactly. You know, the kind of the measured phrases, the vague commitments, the press statements where everyone just kind of nods and reads between the lines.
Yeah.
We are throwing that polite script out the window today.
Good, because the source material certainly did.
It really did. Today's deep dive is based on a dense, incredibly wide-ranging, and stunningly candid briefing from a senior U.S. official. Now, the sources identify this official as Marco Rubio, and he is laying out the raw, unvarnished, strategic worldview operating behind the foreign policy of the Trump administration.
It is a remarkably blunt dissection of global power dynamics. I mean,
Right.
We are looking at a doctrine that is just brutally pragmatic.
Super pragmatic.
The gloves are entirely off, and the administration is laying out exactly how they view their levers of power, their allies, and obviously their adversaries.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of this, I need to lay down a crucial ground rule for you, the listener, because you are going to hear some very strong, politically charged statements today.
Definitely.
This briefing covers everything from the actions of previous U.S. administrations to the fundamental legitimacy of international courts. So, let me be clear. We are not here to take a side. We are not here to endorse a policy, and we are certainly not here to validate the rhetoric. Our job, our only mission today on this deep dive, is to unpack the geopolitical worldview presented in these sources.
Exactly.
We want you to understand the exact strategies being deployed on the world stage, the logic behind them, and how they actually function in practice.
Basically, we are acting as translators of strategy.
I like that.
We're looking at the mechanics. When a policy is announced, what is the intended chain reaction, whether we are talking about economic sanctions, weapon shipments, or just diplomatic posturing? Every single move is part of a larger interconnected strategy.
And the scope of this specific strategy is just massive. I mean, here's our roadmap for today. We are going to examine a radically reshaped Middle Eastern dynamic.
Which includes a pretty wild claim about Iran.
Oh, a stunning claim about Iran, plus a highly secretive nuclear dance with Saudi Arabia. Then we will dissect the brutal, really industrial-scale math of the Ukraine war.
It's grim stuff, but necessary to understand.
Yeah. And then we will return to the Indo-Pacific to understand how the U.S. is really testing its treaties against China, and then look at the collapsing economies and fragile democratic transitions in our own backyard with Cuba and Venezuela.
And it all culminates in one big philosophical point.
Right. Finally, we'll tie all of these threads together with a very stark, overarching declaration about absolute American sovereignty.
It is a sweeping itinerary, to say the least, but it really all connects back to that core philosophy. It's about how the United States intends to project power and maintain control in an increasingly chaotic world.
Let's start right in the center of that chaos, in the Middle East, with what the source describes as the Iranian pressure cooker.
Okay, let's get into it.
The briefing makes this jaw-dropping claim right out of the gate. The official states that Iran is, quote, begging us both directly and indirectly for a deal.
Begging, that's a strong word for a superpower to use about an adversary.
Right, and they are allegedly sending back-channel messages through third-party foreign ministers like every single day.
The mechanics of how those back channels actually work is fascinating just in itself.
Break that down for us because I think a lot of people just assume there's a red telephone somewhere.
Right, exactly.
Huh.
But the United States and Iran do not have formal diplomatic relations.
Haven't for decades.
Exactly.
Right.
So when Tehran wants to communicate with Washington, they literally can't just pick up at the phone. They have to rely on intermediaries.
Like you.
Historically, this has involved nations like Oman, Qatar, or occasionally European allies who still maintain embassies in both capitals.
Okay.
So a foreign minister from one of these intermediary countries will receive a message in Tehran, physically fly to Washington, or maybe meet an American counterpart in a neutral location like Geneva and relay the message.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a slow, cumbersome, and highly deliberate way of negotiating. There are no accidental texts here.
And according to the source, the message coming through these daily back channels is this desperate plea to cut a deal and relieve the economic pressure. But the U.S. is flat out refusing to engage.
You're shutting it down.
The door is totally shut. Which leads me to ask why. I mean, if your adversary is begging for a deal, isn't that exactly the moment you sit down at the table and dictate your terms?
You would think so, logically.
Right.
But to understand the strategy there, you have to look at the historical grievance that's outlined in the briefing.
Okay, what's the grievance?
The perspective presented by the administration is that Iran habitually breaks deals or, immediately demands to alter them the literal moment the ink is dry.
So there's zero trust.
Less than zero.
Yeah.
The source explicitly points back to the previous nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, noting the administration's firm belief that it was violated almost from the start.
Okay, so they feel burned.
Right. So the strategic calculus here is that any negotiation right now would merely result in a temporary tactical pause.
A tactical pause.
Yeah. The U.S. feels Iran isn't looking to permanently abandon its ambitions. They're just looking for a breather. They want sanctions lifted just long enough to inject a bunch of cash back into their system, rebuild their infrastructure, and then, surprise, resume their activities.
So the U.S. strategy is one of just unrelenting cumulative pressure. They are intentionally letting the meter run, refusing to give them that breather.
Exactly.
And the toll that meter is taking, according to the source, is absolute devastation for the Iranian military infrastructure.
The word they use is decimated, I believe.
Yes. The briefing describes Iran's defense industrial base as being systematically decimated. They are allegedly losing missile launchers and advanced radar systems on a nightly basis, suffering billions of dollars in damage.
We have to pause here and really consider what losing your defense industrial base actually means for a modern nation-state.
Yeah, paint that picture, because it sounds like more than just a few exploded trucks.
Oh, it's so much more. This isn't just about losing a few weapons in a skirmish on the border. A defense industrial base, it includes the manufacturing plants.
Right.
It includes the highly specialized machinery required for enriching uranium or machining delicate missile components. It's the research and development labs. And crucially, the highly trained personnel required to operate all of them.
So it's the entire ecosystem.
Exactly. When the source says this base is being decimated, they are talking about rolling back Iran's military capabilities by years, if not decades.
Wow.
Because replacing a destroyed, advanced radar installation isn't like buying a new Jeep. It requires importing highly restricted dual-use technology on the black market.
Which has to be a nightmare under current sanctions.
It's incredibly expensive and painfully slow, especially under those crushing economic sanctions. You can't just order this stuff on Amazon.
And the source provides a very vivid, honestly almost mocking visual to hammer this point home, specifically regarding Iran's naval capacity.
Right, the boat comment.
Yeah, the official explicitly claims that there is no such thing as an Iranian navy anymore. They say it has been reduced to a handful of Boston whalers.
That rhetorical flourish is just incredibly telling.
I mean, a Boston whaler is a small civilian recreational fishing boat, right?
Exactly. By using that specific comparison, the official is aggressively stripping away the veneer of Iran as a near-peer military competitor in the region.
Humbling them, basically.
Yeah. I mean, Iran has historically projected power in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, using these swarms of fast attack craft to harass commercial shipping and even foreign navies. The U.S. is essentially claiming that this asymmetric naval threat has been neutralized to the point of being a total joke.
But I guess my question is, what is the ultimate end game here? Because if you are pummeling a country's infrastructure night after night and reducing their supposed navy to recreational rowboats, the assumption is usually that you're trying to topple the government, right?
That's the usual playbook.
But the briefing takes a major pivot here. The objective, they say, is not necessarily regime change.
And that is a crucial distinction to make. I mean, the history of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is deeply, painfully entangled with the concept of regime change.
Often with disastrous, decades-long consequences.
Precisely. So the worldview presented in this briefing actively distances itself from that specific goal. The source is very clear. The stated singular goal is a strictly denuclearized Iran.
Right. The official says, quote, "The U.S. is seeking a denuclearized Iran that will never have a nuclear weapon." They definitely don't shy away from their disdain for the leadership. I mean, they refer to them as radical clerics who slaughter their own people. But the military and economic actions seem laser-focused on degrading the capacity to project power.
Specifically nuclear power.
Right, not necessarily organizing a coup in Tehran.
The operating philosophy here is that you don't actually need to rebuild the Iranian government and America's image. You just need to render the current government physically incapable of building a nuclear warhead or projecting force across the region.
So it's a containment through destruction.
Exactly. It is a containment strategy achieved through severe structural degradation.
And the economic paradox of how Iran even got into this horrific position is something the source spends a lot of time on. The official points out that, on paper, Iran should be the richest country in the Middle East.
They have all the natural advantages.
They really do. Massive oil reserves, natural gas, a huge, highly educated population, and a geographically strategic location. They have all the ingredients for massive economic prosperity, but instead, what are they dealing with? Hyperinflation, crippling food shortages, and even gas shortages in a country that literally sits on an ocean of petroleum.
It defies logic. The briefing really paints a picture of a leadership that is either completely oblivious to basic macroeconomics or just completely insulated from the domestic suffering of its own populace.
Right.
The wealth of the nation is being systematically diverted away from domestic infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, and funneled into a sprawling multi-front foreign policy project.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy because I think it helps frame it. It's like a billionaire heir who inherits this massive, highly profitable family estate.
Okay, I'm with you.
But instead of investing in the factories, paying the workers and making everyone in the town rich, this heir drains the family accounts to secretly fund a dozen different violent street gangs in neighboring cities.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, his own mansion is literally crumbling. The roof is caving in, and his own employees are starving in the yard. Iran is funneling its immense potential wealth into this massive global proxy web funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen.
Not to mention the billions poured into building long-range rockets and kamikaze drones.
Exactly. So the strategy outlined by the U.S. is essentially to bankrupt that heir by neutralizing those street gangs and destroying the very weapons he's buying night after night.
Yes. By degrading their factories and launch sites, the U.S. is forcing the Iranian leadership to feel the acute, undeniable financial burn of their foreign policy choices.
Making it hurt at home.
The logic is that you simply cannot sustain a sprawling multi-front proxy war when your domestic industrial base is being pulverized and your currencies at freefall. Eventually, the math simply doesn't work.
So they're betting on internal collapse.
The internal pressure from a starving populace and a failing economy will theoretically force the clerics to abandon their nuclear and proxy ambitions just to survive politically.
But I have to push back on the timeline of that logic, just based on what the source is saying.
Okay, go for it.
If they are already suffering billions in damage, if their industrial base is totally crushed, and they are literally begging for a deal through foreign ministers every day, why is the U.S. president still holding out?
Because of the tactical pause we mentioned earlier.
But if the goal is denuclearization and they are begging to talk, why not take the win? Why not sit down in Geneva and write up a new treaty that permanently halts the program right now? Isn't ignoring them just prolonging the regional instability?
It's a fair question. But the administration's calculus is that negotiating right now would be premature because the pain hasn't fundamentally altered the regime's core ideology.
It's just made things hard for them.
Right. It has merely made their current operations wildly inconvenient. The assessment is that Iran isn't actually ready to adhere to a permanent verifiable denuclearization deal.
Right.
They just want the immediate bombing and the worst of the sanctions to stop so they can regroup.
Yeah, I
If the U.S. negotiates now, they hand Iran the exact tactical pause they are desperate for. The worldview in the briefing is that the price has to get so astronomically high and the structural damage to their military complex so profound that Iran is forced into a permanent structural capitulation.
So they don't want a promise. They want physical inability.
Exactly. The U.S. isn't waiting for a diplomatic concession on a piece of paper. They are waiting for the physical inability of Iran to ever resume the program, completely regardless of their intentions.
Man, it is a high-stakes, incredibly dangerous game of chicken played with billions of dollars in sophisticated military infrastructure. And funding these street gangs, as we called them in that analogy, has real-world immediate consequences that don't just stay neatly contained within the borders of the Middle East.
Oh, they definitely spill over.
They spill out into global trade rights, which leads us perfectly into the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthis.
And this is where the butterfly effect of global geopolitics becomes just starkly visible and where the limits of proxy warfare are really exposed for everyone to see.
The source describes the Houthis in Yemen, and the language used is highly specific. The official says the Houthis were previously seen as smart because they largely stayed out of the broader regional conflicts.
Right, they were locally focused.
They were focused on their own civil war in Yemen, but now the source says they have been suckered or snookered by Iran into attacking international shipping in the Red Sea.
The strategic miscalculation here is just massive.
Yeah.
The Houthis, by entering the Red Sea shipping conflict, have completely transformed themselves from a localized rebel group fighting a regional civil war into a global maritime threat that affects the economies of dozens of nations.
And the source highlights a very specific, highly volatile incident to illustrate the sheer danger of this dynamic. The Houthis attacked a Saudi fuel ship, but that ship was flagged to China.
Yeah.
Let me stop you right there, because the concept of maritime flagging is confusing to a lot of people.
It's incredibly weird if you aren't in the shipping industry.
A Saudi ship flagged to China. How does that work? Why do shipping companies do it? And why is it such a massive geopolitical headache in this specific instance?
Okay, so it is a quirk of international maritime law that has massive geopolitical implications.
Yeah.
Every commercial vessel on the ocean must be registered to a specific country, which is known as its flag state.
Okay.
The flag state has regulatory control over the vessel, so they dictate the safety standards, the labor laws for the crew, and crucially, the taxes the shipping company pays.
Which is why you see so many ships registered to tiny countries.
Exactly. Shipping companies often choose flag states based on favorable tax rates or very lenient regulations. This is why so many ships are flagged to Panama or Liberia or the Marshall Islands.
But there's a diplomatic side to it too, right?
Yes, and this is the vital part. The flag state also provides diplomatic and legal protection. The ship operates essentially as an extension of that nation's sovereignty on the open ocean. But in this case, a Saudi-owned vessel carrying Saudi fuel chose to fly the flag of the People's Republic of China.
Presumably because they thought flying a Chinese flag would protect them. I mean, China is Iran's biggest oil customer and economic lifeline.
Yep.
The logic would be that Iranian-backed proxies aren't going to shoot at a ship flying the flag of Iran's best friend.
That is exactly the logic, and it failed catastrophically. The headache here is monumental, because China famously operates on a doctrine of non-interference.
Right. They like to stay out of the mess.
They prefer to observe Middle Eastern conflicts from afar, secure their energy contracts, and just do business. They do not want to be the world's policeman. But if Iranian-backed proxies start blowing up Chinese-flagged ships, it directly threatens Chinese sovereign interests.
It forces Beijing's hand.
Exactly. It creates immense pressure in Beijing to respond, to protect their maritime rights, and to secure their supply chains. It threatens to drag a global superpower directly into a kinetic conflict in a region they actively try to avoid fighting in.
Which is exactly what Iran probably does not want. They do not want to anger Beijing and risk losing their only major buyer of sanctioned oil.
It's their worst nightmare.
But wait, the source says the Houthis got suckered into this? That implies the Houthis didn't fully understand the consequences, or maybe they didn't even mean to hit that specific ship. It raises a huge question about proxy warfare. How much control does Iran actually have over these groups?
That is the big question.
Are the Houthis just like remote-controlled drones operated from a desk in Tehran, or do they have their own agency and make your own mistakes?
That is the defining question of modern counterterrorism and proxy warfare. It's often referred to in political science as the principal agent problem.
Okay, lay that out for us.
The briefing suggests a significant disconnect between the principal, which is Iran, and the agent, which is the Houthis. Iran provides the funding, the ballistic missiles, the drone technology, and the broad strategic directives like, go disrupt the Red Sea.
Right.
But Iran does not necessarily control the day-to-day tactical execution with perfect precision.
So a Houthi radar operator in Sana'a looks at a blip on a screen, misidentifies the AIS, the automatic identification system signal of a ship, assumes it's American or Israeli, and fires a missile.
Exactly.
And suddenly Beijing is furious at Tehran.
Precisely. Furthermore, the Houthis have their own domestic political incentives back in Yemen. Defying the West, attacking ships, and projecting regional power makes them look strong to their own population.
Right. It plays well at home.
Yeah, they're a deeply ideological group, not just mercenaries on a payroll. So Iran might hand them a loaded gun and point them at the Red Sea, but the Houthis are the ones pulling the trigger.
And sometimes they miss the intended target.
When they hit the wrong target, like a Chinese flag vessel, it shows the inherent, unavoidable danger of relying on proxies. They're unpredictable, their intelligence gathering is often pretty rudimentary, and their tactical mistakes instantly become Iran's strategic catastrophes.
It's the danger of outsourcing your military operations. You completely lose quality control. And in the Red Sea, a lack of quality control means you disrupt the global supply chain, you spike inflation in Europe, and suddenly have the Chinese government demanding answers from your foreign ministry. It underscores exactly why the U.S. is hitting Iran so hard economically, like we discussed.
It all connects.
The goal isn't just to stop the nuclear program, it's to cut off the funding to the Houthis, so these exact types of chaotic, localized miscalculations stop threatening global stability.
The worldview here is that chaos in the Red Sea is merely a symptom. The actual disease is the unchecked flow of capital and weapons from Tehran.
Speaking of complex power dynamics in the Middle East, this brings us to a part of the briefing that honestly blew my mind because it feels completely counterintuitive.
Oh, the Saudi deal.
Yes, we just spent all this time detailing the absolute necessity of keeping nuclear technology out of the Middle East, specifically preventing Iran from acquiring it. But then the source casually reveals that the U.S. Energy Department entered into a formal cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia last November regarding a peaceful civil nuclear program.
It is a phenomenal paradox on the surface, isn't it?
It makes no sense at first glance. You are deploying aircraft carriers to stop one nation from splitting the atom, while literally signing contracts to help their next-door neighbor do the exact same thing. It sounds absolutely insane. Why on earth would the U.S. give nuclear technology to a Middle Eastern monarchy, knowing how volatile the region is, while simultaneously deploying its military might to strip that exact same capability from Iran? Aren't you just sparking a nuclear arms race?
To understand this, we have to dive deep into a concept often referred to in diplomatic circles as being the partner of choice.
Partner of choice, okay.
The stark, uncomfortable reality outlined in the briefing is this. The United States is not the only country in the world that offers nuclear technology anymore. We are no longer in the post-WWII era where the U.S. and the Soviets held an absolute lockdown monopoly on this science.
Right. The official acknowledges this directly, saying, quote, "We're not the only show in town, but we're the best show in town."
Exactly. So the geopolitical calculus goes like this. Saudi Arabia is a wealthy, rapidly developing nation with massive energy needs. They want to diversify away from relying solely on their own oil for domestic power grids so they can save that oil for lucrative export.
Makes economic sense.
They have made a sovereign decision that they are going to acquire civil nuclear energy, period. If the U.S. takes a moral high ground and says, no, the Middle East is too dangerous, we won't help you build reactors, Saudi Arabia won't just give up. They will simply turn to a competitor.
And that competitor will likely be who? China? Russia?
Mostly Russia. Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear energy corporation, is highly aggressive in selling reactors globally.
And I'm guessing if Russia or China builds these reactors in the Saudi desert, they aren't exactly demanding strict international safety checks or demanding that the Saudis promise never to build a bomb.
You'd be guessing correctly. If a competitor provides the technology, the United States loses everything. They lose visibility into the program, they lose geopolitical influence in Riyadh, and they lose control over how that program develops over the next 50 years.
The nightmare scenario for Washington is a Chinese-built nuclear reactor in Saudi Arabia operating without any American oversight.
Precisely. However, if the United States is the one providing the technology, specifically newer, safer advancements like small modular reactors or SMRs, then the U.S. gets to dictate the terms of the contract.
Because they hold the keys?
Yes, the source explicitly mentions implementing strict safeguards and what they call the gold standard additional protocols.
Let's break down those terms because they seem critical to the whole justification. What are safeguards and additional protocols in the context of an international nuclear deal?
The additional protocol is a specific, legally binding agreement designed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. When a country signs it, they grant international inspectors incredibly intrusive, short-notice access to all of their nuclear facilities and even suspected non-nuclear facilities.
So they can just show up.
Pretty much. It means inspectors can show up unannounced, take environmental swabs to check for trace amounts of highly enriched uranium, and audit the entire supply chain. It ensures that not a single gram of uranium can be secretly diverted from a civilian power plant into a covert weapons program.
So the U.S. leverages the tech to force transparency.
Right. The U.S. will only sell the technology if Saudi Arabia agrees to this gold standard of transparency. Furthermore, the U.S. often demands limits on a country's right to domestically enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium, which are the two physical pathways to building a bomb.
So by being the supplier, the U.S. essentially gets to bake espionage and absolute oversight legally into the infrastructure of the Saudi energy grid.
It is harm reduction on a massive geopolitical scale. The logic is that you cannot stop the proliferation of civil nuclear power. The technology is just too widespread now, but you can control the architecture of it to ensure it remains purely civil.
It's all about maintaining leverage.
Exactly. By making American companies the architects, the builders, and the maintainers of Saudi Arabia's energy future, the U.S. weaves itself inextricably into the fabric of their national security and economic infrastructure. If the Saudis ever try to break out and build a weapon, the U.S. would know immediately because American technicians and international inspectors are literally in the building.
Wow. It's a very pragmatic, honestly, almost cold-blooded calculation. You manage the immense risk of nuclear proliferation by owning and monopolizing the process itself. It's the ultimate expression of control.
It really is.
Now, we've seen how the U.S. manages conflict and alliances in the Middle East through economic strangulation, managing proxies, and controlling energy deals. But how does this exact same pragmatic worldview apply to a hot, grinding, traditional land war?
Let's move our focus to Europe.
Yeah, let's look at the brutal reality of the war in Ukraine.
The language used in the briefing to describe the conflict in Ukraine is deeply sobering. It really strips away the heroism and focuses purely on the arithmetic of destruction.
It is incredibly grim. The source describes the war as a senseless war and cites numbers that are genuinely hard to fathom. The official states that Russian forces are losing upwards of 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers a week.
A week.
A week. That is the population of a small town being wiped out every 7 days. But there was one specific military statistic the source highlighted that I really want to spend some time on because it reveals the true nature of this conflict.
The KI rate.
Yes. The official notes that this is the only conflict anyone in the military can recall where the killed in action rate, the KIA rate, is actually higher than the casualty rate.
When military analysts and historians look at that specific statistic, it is horrifying.
Why is it so unusual?
To understand why, we have to look at the historical math of warfare. Typically, in modern combat, for every one soldier killed in action, you have 3 to 4 soldiers who are wounded, injured, or otherwise incapacitated. Those wounded soldiers make up the bulk of the broader casualty metric.
Right, because if you get hit by shrapnel or a bullet, you are incapacitated, making you a casualty. But ideally, someone comes to get you, treats you, and you survive.
Exactly. The cornerstone of modern military doctrine, especially in Western armies, is medical evacuation and the concept of the golden hour.
The golden hour, right?
It's the idea that if you can get a wounded soldier to a surgical unit within 60 minutes, their chances of survival skyrocket. Modern armies invest heavily in medevac helicopters, armored ambulances, field hospitals, and highly trained combat medics.
So if the killed in action rate is actually surpassing the general casualty rate in Ukraine, what does that imply?
It implies a complete systemic breakdown of that medical infrastructure on the Russian side.
It suggests a battlefield environment where if you are wounded, you are simply left to die in a trench.
Yes. It means medical evacuation is either non-existent or physically impossible because the airspace is too heavily contested by cheap, lethal drones. It suggests that wounded soldiers are just bleeding out from survivable injuries.
God, that's bleak.
Or Alternatively, it means the strikes being utilized massive indiscriminate artillery barrages, thermobaric weapons, or drone swarms are so devastatingly lethal that there are very few wounded survivors left to rescue at all.
If an artillery shell lands directly in a trench, you don't get 3 wounded and 1 killed, you just get 4 killed.
Exactly. This statistic speaks to a level of raw, industrial-scale slaughter and a fundamental disregard for human life that is reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I, but updated with terrifying 21st century precision technology.
It makes the term meat grinder terrifyingly literal. And the source makes it clear that Ukraine is paying a tremendous price as well, dealing with civilian deaths, destroyed infrastructure, and continuous strikes on Kyiv. Which brings us to the diplomatic side of this tragedy.
Right, the peace proposals.
The briefing discusses why previous peace proposals have failed. It specifically mentions something called the 3+2 proposal, which the source describes as the trading of terror. The official bluntly states that it failed because Ukraine fundamentally could not accept it.
Any peace deal, by definition, requires both sides to find the terms acceptable. The briefing points out an obvious but often overlooked reality in diplomatic circles. You cannot force an allied sovereign nation to accept terms that fundamentally compromise their core sovereignty or territory just because the international community wants the fighting to stop.
They won't just surrender territory for a breather.
Right. The source notes that whatever compromises might have been on the table previously are likely entirely unacceptable to Ukraine now, given the sheer volume of blood that has been spilled and the atrocities committed. The domestic politics of Ukraine simply won't allow a capitulation.
But the U.S. administration claims it is ready to offer new ideas and new concepts for peace when the conditions are right, precisely because the current situation is an unacceptable, senseless loss of life. But while the politicians wait for diplomacy to catch up to the reality on the ground, the war still has to be fought, and it has to be supplied.
And logistics win wars.
Exactly. And this is where the briefing gets really granular on the mechanics of U.S. support. The source mentions how U.S. arms sales to Ukraine are actually being conducted because they aren't just driving trucks full of ammunition over the border in the dead of night.
We know it's highly bureaucratized.
The official says, quote, "We sell arms via Pearl, which is an initiative we have through NATO."
The mention of the Pearl Initiative is a great glimpse into the actual bureaucratic plumbing of international alliances. It's important for listeners to understand that international arms transfers are incredibly complex, highly regulated legal maneuvers.
You don't just ship Javelin missiles via FedEx.
No, you definitely do not. The U.S. utilizes processes like foreign military sales programs and specific NATO initiatives to move these assets legally and safely.
So how does an initiative like Pearl actually work in practice?
Utilizing a formalized NATO pipeline accomplishes several things at once. First, it standardizes the procurement process. It ensures that the weapons being sent, whether they are American artillery shells or European armored vehicles, are interoperable.
Meaning they can work together.
Meaning they use the same ammunition calibers and communication frequencies. You don't want to send a tank that can't shoot the ammo you just sent.
Right, that makes sense.
Second, it manages the complex legal framework of end-user certificates, which are legally binding documents ensuring the weapons don't end up on the black market. But crucially, running the sales through a NATO initiative provides a layer of institutional legitimacy.
It's not just America acting alone.
Exactly. It transforms the arming of Ukraine from a unilateral American action into a shared collective burden among NATO members. It's a formalized, audited pipeline designed to sustain a long-term conflict.
It really illustrates that even in the absolute chaos and WWI-style brutality of a land war, the slow, methodical bureaucracy of alliances is still churning away in the background, managing the logistics of survival.
Bureaucracy saves lives in this context.
But the U.S. commitment to its alliances isn't just happening on paper in European boardrooms. It is being physically, literally tested in the waters of the Indo-Pacific. Which brings us back to where we started today and the incredibly tense flashpoints in Asia.
The Indo-Pacific is arguably the most volatile, long-term theater of competition for the United States, far surpassing the Middle East or Europe in terms of global economic stakes.
Without a doubt. The briefing outlines several intense escalations. China is launching live-fire military drills in the Taiwan Strait, which the source explicitly calls a destabilizing event.
Very provocative.
But it's the confrontation with the Philippines that truly highlights the danger. We talked about the Chinese vessels using water cannons on Philippine ships near Scarborough Shoal and the American Coast Guard vessel stepping in.
This is not just a localized maritime dispute over fishing rights. This is a direct, calculated challenge to a mutual defense treaty. The United States and the Philippines signed a mutual defense treaty in 1951.
Which means, in the simplest terms, if the armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft of the Philippines are attacked in the Pacific, the United States is legally obligated to treat it as an attack on itself and respond.
Exactly. And the Chinese Coast Guard's aggressive actions, using military-grade lasers, ramming vessels, and using high-pressure water cannons that cause severe injuries, are constantly pushing the boundary of what constitutes an armed attack that would trigger that treaty.
They're testing the waters, literally.
When the U.S. Coast Guard vessel positions itself between the Philippine ship and the Chinese aggressors, it is the ultimate game of geopolitical brinkmanship. The U.S. is saying, if you want to hit our ally, you have to hit an American ship first. Are you willing to start World War III over a resupply mission to a rusty ship on a shoal?
It takes the abstract promise of deterrence and makes it physically real.
It forces China to make a hard choice.
But it's an incredibly terrifying tightrope. The source explicitly acknowledges the gravity of this relationship. The official states that the U.S. must have a positive relationship with China. You are dealing with the two most powerful economies in the world, two massive, highly advanced militaries, and two nuclear powers.
The stakes could be higher.
The official says, quote, "We have to have a relationship with China. If the U.S. and China go to war, the global economy collapses overnight. How does a policymaker balance placing a Coast Guard ship in the line of fire with the absolute necessity of maintaining global economic stability?"
That is the defining geopolitical balancing act of our century. The worldview presented in the source attempts to balance this dual reality. The U.S. recognizes the economic suicide of a conflict with Beijing, but it outright refuses to prioritize that relationship at the expense of its treaty allies or the broader principle of freedom of navigation in international waters.
So they won't back down on the principles.
The philosophy operating here is that capitulation on smaller issues, like allowing China to illegally claim a shoal in the South China Sea through bullying, inevitably invites aggression on larger catastrophic issues.
Like Taiwan.
Like an invasion of Taiwan. Deterrence only works if the line in the sand is rigidly physically defended, even at the risk of escalation. If China believes the U.S. won't risk a Coast Guard cutter for the Philippines, they will assume the U.S. won't risk an aircraft carrier for Taiwan.
But the briefing also makes it clear that the U.S. isn't just offering a blank check of protection to its allies in the Pacific. There is a very clear, almost transactional demand being made.
Right, the burden sharing.
The official says, quote, "We're now in many cases dealing with advanced and wealthy economies who have the ability to spend more on their own defense, and they should." They specifically call out Japan and the Philippines.
This is a recurring, increasingly loud theme in modern U.S. foreign policy. The demand for burden sharing. The historical context is really important here. After WWII, countries like Japan adopted pacifist constitutions and relied almost entirely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella and military presence for their security.
Which allowed them to focus entirely on economic growth.
Exactly. They built economic empires while the U.S. handled the security bill.
But the U.S. is essentially saying the post-WWII free ride is over.
Precisely. The message is blunt. We will honor our treaty commitments. We will put our Coast Guard cutters in harm's way to protect your sovereignty. But you are no longer fragile, developing nations recovering from a world war. You are wealthy, advanced economies.
Time to step up.
The primary responsibility of any sovereign government is its own national security. You need to buy more ships, train more troops, increase your defense budgets, and shoulder a much larger share of the financial and physical cost of deterring China in your own backyard.
It's a shift from a protectorate relationship to a genuine burden-sharing partnership. And speaking of the complexities of domestic governance and economic realities, let's bring our focus back to our own hemisphere. The contrast presented in the briefing between the situations in Cuba and Venezuela is fascinating.
It is a study in two very different stages of systemic collapse and political transition.
Let's start with Cuba. The source does not mince words when diagnosing the island's problems. The official states that the economy in Cuba is failing because the leaders simply don't know what an economy is supposed to look like.
They've never had to build one.
They have operated a rigid command economy that has relied entirely on what the source calls freeloading. For decades, they survived on massive subsidies from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they eventually found a new patron in Hugo Chávez's Venezuela, surviving on cheap Venezuelan oil.
Right.
But now, for the first time in modern history, they don't have a wealthy sponsor willing to write them a blank check.
And the analysis in the briefing pinpoints the exact psychological barrier that is preventing meaningful reform in Havana. It's not just a matter of economic incompetence, though the source certainly implies that. It is fundamentally about fear.
Fear of what?
The leadership knows the economy is collapsing. They desperately want to improve the economic conditions just enough to stop the widespread domestic unrest and protests that have been happening. But they are absolutely terrified of the cure.
Why?
They know that if they grant too much economic freedom, if they allow private enterprise to truly flourish, if they allow citizens to accumulate private wealth and own businesses, they will inevitably lose political control over the population.
Because economic independence breeds political independence.
Exactly. The Cuban regime's power rests on dependency. If a citizen relies entirely on the state for their food rations, their employment, their health care, and their housing, they are far less likely to risk protesting or demanding political rights.
They can't afford to bite the hand that feeds them.
But the moment a citizen can earn their own living, independent of the state apparatus, the state loses its primary lever of coercion. The regime in Havana is trapped in a paradox of their own making. The only way to save the country from economic ruin is to relinquish the very control that keeps them in power.
So they choose ruin over reform.
Every time.
Which perfectly sets up the situation in a country that is actively trying to claw its way out of that exact type of authoritarian regime, Venezuela.
Right, which used to be Cuba's patron.
The source discusses a highly anticipated political transition starting in August between an interim government and the recognized 2015 National Assembly. They mention opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado playing a vital role. But rather than just cheering for democracy, the briefing hints at the sheer logistical mountain of this transition. I want to focus on the mechanics of that.
Rebuilding a fractured nation is a monumental, grinding task, and we often romanticize it in the West.
We really do.
We tend to think of democratic transitions as simply holding an election, a dictator stepping down, and everyone cheering in the streets. But the reality is entirely about infrastructure.
I want to pose a thought experiment to you, the listener. Imagine you have been a street protester in Caracas for 2 decades. Your entire political identity has been defined by resistance. You are an expert at organizing underground rallies, dodging tear gas, communicating via encrypted apps, and surviving the brutality of a regime.
Right, you're a revolutionary.
Exactly. How do you suddenly flip a switch and become a bureaucratic, vote-counting, policy-writing political party?
It is an incredibly difficult pivot, and many opposition movements fail right at that moment. The source implies the massive requirements needed after 25 years of an authoritarian regime systematically dismantling the state.
Where do you even begin?
First, you have to establish a genuinely free and open press. Candidates need to actually communicate their platforms to the rural areas without the state media blacking them out or the secret police arresting journalists.
You also have to figure out who is even allowed to vote.
Yes. The voter rolls in Venezuela are notoriously manipulated. You have millions of refugees who fled the country do they get to vote. How do you securely register them in foreign embassies that might still be controlled by the old regime?
It's a logistical nightmare.
Then you have to create an honest electoral council that will accurately count the votes, which means building the technical architecture of a secure digital or paper election completely from scratch while the current regime still controls the levers of government.
And perhaps most fundamentally, you need physical security. You need enough security in the streets to ensure that the ballot boxes aren't stolen by armed regime loyalists, the colectivos, and that everyday citizens aren't being intimidated when they walk into a polling station.
The official notes that this kind of transition requires immense patience and persistence. It doesn't take weeks. It takes years, sometimes a generation, to rebuild the basic trust in civic institutions that a regime has actively dismantled.
It's just hard work.
It's about the painful, unglamorous work of turning a movement of resistance into a functioning movement of governance. The U.S. role, as defined in the source, is to facilitate and support that reconciliation, not dictate it, recognizing that every element of Venezuelan society needs to be represented for it to hold.
This discussion of domestic political control and the struggle for democratic sovereignty leads us perfectly into our final topic, a concept that really underpins every single decision, strategy, and policy we've discussed today: American sovereignty on a global scale.
This is the big philosophical takeaway.
This section of the briefing contains some of the most fiery, uncompromising rhetoric in the entire document, specifically regarding the International Criminal Court, or the ICC.
The rejection of the ICC in this source is total, absolute, and highly aggressive.
Total is the right word. The official refers to the members and prosecutors of the ICC as lunatics and crazies who are attempting to claim legal jurisdiction over U.S. military members and potentially even U.S. presidents for actions taken during conflicts.
They don't mince words.
Not at all. The source emphatically reminds the press that the United States never signed the ICC treaty, is not a member of the court, and vows total non-compliance. The official states bluntly, quote, "They're not going to apply their jurisdiction to Americans. That's just not going to happen."
To understand the ferocity of this stance, we have to look at the history of the U.S. relationship with international tribunals and connect it to a broader foundational philosophy of sovereignty.
Give us the background on the ICC.
The ICC was established by the Rome Statute to prosecute individuals for international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. While the U.S. participated in the initial negotiations, it ultimately refused to ratify the treaty.
Why?
The fundamental American objection is that submitting an American soldier, intelligence officer, or elected official to an international tribunal in The Hague, a court composed of judges from other nations, some of whom may be adversaries, is not just a legal overreach. It is a fundamental violation of national sovereignty.
The U.S. position is essentially, we have our own military justice system. If an American soldier commits a war crime, they will be court-martialed by the United States under U.S. law, not judged by a panel of foreign lawyers.
Exactly. This philosophy is so deeply ingrained that in 2002, the U.S. passed the American Service Members Protection Act, which is colloquially known as the Hague Invasion Act.
That is a wild title.
It literally authorizes the president to use all means necessary and appropriate to free U.S. or allied personnel detained by the ICC. That is how seriously the U.S. guards its legal sovereignty.
But here is the fascinating nuance in the briefing. At the exact same time the U.S. official is wholly rejecting international legal bodies and screaming about sovereignty, the source vigorously defends the deep, intimate fusion of U.S. and Israeli military technology.
Yes, specifically Iron Dome.
Right. They mentioned the co-production of the Iron Dome missile defense system.
Right. A reporter essentially asked, if you are so fiercely protective of American sovereignty and independence, doesn't sharing highly classified military technology with a foreign ally pose a sovereignty concern? Doesn't it make you dependent?
And the official says absolutely not. They explain that co-producing weapons is standard practice because the United States immensely benefits from it. If Israel, which is constantly under rocket fire, develops a technological breakthrough in defeating drones or intercepting missiles, the U.S. wants that technology integrated into its own defense systems immediately.
Two-way street.
Sharing the R&D burden makes both nations stronger. But, and this is the crucial caveat, the official notes, that the U.S. always retains veto power over third-party transfers.
This is the linchpin of the entire doctrine. If Israel wants to sell an Iron Dome system, which was co-developed with U.S. funding and technology to a third country, they must get permission from Washington first.
So Washington has the final say.
If the U.S. says no, the sale dies. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this specific detail perfectly encapsulates the overarching worldview presented in this entire Rubio briefing. It is about absolute, unapologetic American sovereignty and control.
Control is the operative word.
The U.S. will happily share technology, co-produce advanced weapons, and forge deep military alliances to leverage foreign breakthroughs. But it will always write the contract in a way that gives Washington the final say, the veto power over where those weapons go and how they are used.
Hold on, let me stop you right there. That is the exact same logic as the Saudi nuclear deal we talked about earlier.
It is the exact same logic. Provide the technology to maintain the leverage. Own the process to own the outcome. The through line of this entire foreign policy approach is control.
It's brilliantly consistent in a very ruthless way.
Whether it's dictating the terms of a civil nuclear program in the Saudi desert by insisting on American reactors, placing a Coast Guard cutter between foreign vessels in the Pacific to uphold a defense treaty strictly on American terms, or flatly rejecting the legal authority of an international court in The Hague, the strategy is remarkably consistent.
Wow.
It is about the United States dictating the terms of engagement globally on its own terms, wholly unconstrained by international consensus, if that consensus conflicts with American interests.
When you lay it all out like that, connecting the dots from the Middle East to Europe to the Pacific, it is an incredibly cohesive, if undeniably ruthless, geopolitical doctrine.
It really is.
To recap the massive deep dive we've just been on today, We started with the calculated economic strangulation of Iran, an attempt to decimate its proxy network and force a structural capitulation of its nuclear ambitions without firing a shot.
Right.
We looked at the horrifying WWI-style arithmetic of the Ukraine war, analyzing what a higher KIA than casualty rate actually implies about the breakdown of modern military medicine on the front lines.
The meat grinder.
We explored the paradoxical, highly pragmatic necessity of giving Saudi Arabia advanced nuclear technology just to ensure they don't buy a reactor free of safeguards from China or Russia. We saw the physical, dangerous reality of treaty alliances being tested in the South China Sea and discussed the slow, grueling, unglamorous logistical work of building democratic infrastructure in a fractured Venezuela.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. And we ended with a fiery, uncompromising defense of absolute American legal and military sovereignty.
It is a profound, unvarnished look at the levers of global power. But if there is one lingering thread to pull from all of this, one major takeaway from this entire worldview, it's the terrifying interconnectedness of it all.
I think you're right. And based on that intricate web of sources we've just untangled, I know you had a final thought you wanted to leave the listener with today.
Yes. Think back to that single detail we discussed in the Red Sea. A Saudi-owned fuel ship, flagged and legally protected by the sovereignty of China, attacked by Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are funded, armed, and trained by the industrial base of Iran, largely in response to global economic sanctions driven by the United States.
It's dizzying.
In a world where a single localized action by a proxy militia immediately triggers the economic, legal, and military interests of three different global superpowers, is the concept of a strictly regional conflict entirely dead. The next time you see a headline about a skirmish in a remote strait or a border clash that seems thousands of miles away, ask yourself, based on what we've learned today, who is really pulling the strings in the background and who is about to get pulled in.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the mechanics behind the statements, and we'll see you next time.